Today we're going to take a look at some of the fundamental assumptions about artificial intelligence and generative AI that many people take as being true, and let's examine them and see whether they are or are not true, and why taking them as kind of fundamentally true could be dangerous for some groups more than others. So, welcome to the Talk to Me PDD podcast. I'm your host, PDD, podcast where we talk about all things knowledge work, artificial intelligence, society, management, leadership, all sorts of fun stuff. So today is episode 48, questioning AI assumptions. If you like this content, please subscribe, follow the channel. Check me out on all the different platforms. I love listening to podcasts in audio form while I'm driving around, so you can do that with Talk to Me PDD as well. So, what are some of the assumptions about generative AI that have been put out there as sort of foundational assumptions that we can assume are true? So I put together four that I'm going to look at today. There are probably others that you could think of, but we'll start with these ones. So, one, that AI is going to evolve and replace human capabilities. Two, that progress is inevitable, that things will just keep iterating and getting better. Number three, that to take advantage of these new AI tools, that people will need some fundamentally different skills and abilities than what they have today. And they'll need these in order to effectively use the technology and also to not be replaced, to stay relevant and employable. And lastly, the fourth assumption that AI and generative AI is a general purpose technology, meaning that it's going to have wide sweeping impact across a variety of different domains about how people work and interact with information. So now these may all be true. They may all not be true, or there may be some some aspect of them that's true and some that's not. But I think it's useful to not just kind of move on and take them as granted, but to take a look and see whether they apply in your domain or not, as opposed to just going forward based on those assumptions, which is often what I see people doing. So, oftentimes, technology is presented by the companies creating it with assumptions like this, telling how these companies creating the technology expect it to impact, and that's going to align with their particular values. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. In the current tech industry, you don't have to look back that far, just a couple of years, where you can look at the metaverse, which was something that was much hyped to be sort of coming out and reshaping the world in many of the similar ways that we're talking about AI today. And it's largely gone away. So that's not unusual with innovation and with the tech industry in specific. And tech companies are really good at pivoting. I mean, even look at Meta, which renamed itself kind of in honor of the metaverse, now still managing to be successful, focusing on AI and their other core businesses and things like that. Being wrong about an emerging technology or how it's going to impact society isn't really that detrimental to tech companies. They're really good at pivoting. It just kind of comes with the territory. In other fields that aren't as used to pivoting or adapting and change more slowly, the consequences of being wrong about some of these fundamental assumptions can have more consequences than they do for tech companies. I think also, one of the things that's interesting to think about is how the sort of power dynamics of the current AI trends are actually going to play out. A lot of the earlier assumptions in the way the value of AI was sold was that it sort of, takes this the capabilities that were normally only in really large organizations and gives those to every individual. So that's, I have the coming wave over here on this side. That's one of the things that book talks about, sort of the asymmetric capabilities. People have talked about, single person companies being able to, reach unicorn status and things like that. So is that going to play out, that assumption, or is it going to further centralize power just because of all of the sort of capital expenditures and resources necessary to harness these tools, and potentially even use cases, right? Are there the use cases going to be that sort of general purpose use case like a word processor where every individual can benefit and use it, or are they going to be primarily use cases where you have to have a large amount of data and infrastructure to analyze that and extract value from it? So a little bit of an aside there, but something I wanted to touch on. But when you get into fields where they're not necessarily as quick at pivoting as tech, I worry about sort of the impact of taking these AI assumptions for granted. It's thinking specifically about education, looking at kind of all levels from higher ed, down to through grade school, elementary school, that sort of thing. That's not a domain that can really pivot that quickly, and I see, a lot of kind of adapting to incorporate AI already, or even not adapting, but just having it come into the classroom. And that may cause some challenges down the road if some of these assumptions prove out to be different than what we're taking them for. And it can be, some of this push to change, I think, before really critically analyzing all of the impacts of AI is, this fear of being left behind, or not being relevant. Maybe you've put some sunk cost into it now. You've invested in AI infrastructure and training, and maybe there's some cost to your ego or your credibility if you're the one that pushed for that, and then maybe you're re-examining some of those assumptions, and it's not necessarily right for your domain, or maybe it's not totally living up to the promises that it made. So I think it's a good lesson to be controlled and thoughtful, especially in these domains, and domains like education, or you could also look at healthcare, where there are significant consequences to decisions and changes. And we often sort of look down on organizations that have a lot of friction or that are slow to change. And are slow to adopt technology. But there are also some benefits in that friction and sort of those traditional values and what's been learned there. And it's obviously not always the best case to do things the way that they've always done them. But it might be a good counterbalance to not try and go so far to be like an innovative tech company in a traditional field like education or medicine, and balance out, use some of that historical knowledge and subject matter expertise and the way of teaching and treating health issues, and not just abandoning that because some new technology comes out. Especially with AI in the classroom, it's I think an interesting maybe shift in the power dynamic and who's controlling the information, where when tech first started coming into education, it's really like just a tool, a way to enhance learning or to access more information. And now I see it becoming more of the platform itself and almost like the operating system for education. And I think the potential danger with AI in education is that it becomes more than just a tool, but it actually becomes prescriptive into what's being taught and how it's being taught, and the possibility of de-skilling teachers by just sort of making them supervisors for the AI and things like that. Not that that has to happen, but that I think that's a potential possibility, and one that could align in a way that's profitable to AI companies that are in that ed tech space. So I think it's something to be aware of, that we want technology to be a tool that we choose how it's being used, and especially in the education space, that the curriculum and the way information is being taught is being driven by the education organization and not by the tech or AI company that is potentially supporting that or providing tools to use in the classroom. And also to make sure that we're thinking about education not just as a pipeline to prepare workers to participate in industry, but really as a way to build full, well-rounded people that will create a positive society. Yes, of course, you want work skills as well. That's part of it, but that's not the sole goal of education, at least in my opinion. Um, and then it's interesting thinking about sort of what we think of public spaces for at least for a lot of education in the United States versus um, most of the AI companies now are private, and how these two come together. Even with information retrieval like Google and Bing and things like that, you sort of think about these in a way as public services in the way that people access information, but they're not. Obviously, they're private companies. So maybe this is an opportunity where we think about more of a community type tech that gets used in these sort of public service instances, that not necessarily being purely for profit. So anyway, putting that out there, I think it's an interesting thought. Um, so anyway, rambled a little bit there, but I think it's worthwhile, whatever industry you're in, to examine these assumptions, understanding that you know tech can throw out sort of these wild claims. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not, and doesn't so much matter because they can move around very very quickly and shift to different things. Now with all the capital expenditure investment in AI data centers, maybe they can't shift so quickly, but in general, they tech can pivot pretty quickly, whereas other traditional industries can't and maybe shouldn't. So if you're in a more traditional industry, it's probably doubly wise to be a little bit cautious and gradual on how you implement or think about bringing AI workflows into the things that you do. So going back to those assumptions, right? So the first one, is AI going to evolve and replace human skills? I mean, yes, in some areas, and in the same way that the calculators replaced human skills to a certain extent with adding and doing different mathematical operations. Um, but certainly the promise of AGI seems very far away, and even in automated workflows, there are certain sort of tasks that AI can be good at automating or helping. But I think in most professional work, we're very far away from being able to completely take the human out of the loop. Um, that's certainly what a lot of the current solutions have tried to do. It'll be interesting to see, depending on the success or lack of it there, whether we shift to more of human worker augmentation as opposed to replacement. But I would say it's far from a guaranteed assumption that AI is going to replace human skills in many domains. The second one is that progress is inevitable. Um, a lot of this in the AI space came out of the early scaling laws, that just as you get made models bigger and get through more compute at them, they would get better. And that was true for a while, but most people, I think, would agree that it's not totally true now, and you have to use other different techniques. Um, and progress is also a choice. I think a great example is Moore's law, the number of transistors on space on a computer processor. That law has held true, but it's not held true at the same cost. To keep it increasing over time, you have to spend more and more money to cram more and more transistors into a smaller space to make it true. Um, Whether that'll be true with large language models or not remains to be seen. There's no guarantee that they will continue getting better or be able to solve some of the fundamental problems that they have today. That's not to say they're not valuable. I mean, having natural language processing is very useful in a number of scenarios, but it's not a guarantee that it's magically going to transform into superhuman intelligence. Um, and then about AI skilling in use, and I would separate this depending on what your role is. Obviously, if you're in a role that is directly related to AI, you're using it in certain ways, you're going to have one particular path that you need to understand more about, whether it's fundamentals or specific areas. But for the general population, I think of it kind of like using web search. It's not really all that hard, and it depends on critical skills or traditional skills, being critical thinking, being able to examine the information, tell whether it's true or not, go look at sources, validate, use your own knowledge and opinions. And then I think also, as your sense of self and sense of awareness and understanding the nature of the conversation, and that it's not a human conversation. Um, And I think that's an area that is valuable in general, but can help sort of inoculate people on some of the potential harms of going down rabbit holes or mental health spirals when working with chatbots. So both of those things are nothing new. Self-awareness and critical thinking, and I think it's important to keep up building those critical skills, or traditional skills, and potentially even focus on them more than we have in the past. And then, lastly, is generative AI? Is it a general purpose technology? That remains to be seen. There are certainly specific applications now where it's incredibly useful or directly applicable. You could think about language translation. But still, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not useful to learn other languages, or you won't need human language translators in certain scenarios. Um, and it may or may not displace work in certain areas. And some of the areas that it seemed like it would be well suited to displace those jobs, that hasn't really happened yet. I know one kind of early on, looking at administrative assistants, things like that, as a target area that AIs would replace. I don't think that's really happening yet. And I think it's because those roles are much more than some of the tasks that we might think of them as, but actually have a lot of human relationships and decision making, and other types of understanding that is not easily captured in the job description and the task that job does. Um, so I think, the assumption of a general purpose technology may prove out to be true, but I think it's not likely in the short term. And then lastly, not really an assumption, but just kind of another aside or something that I think is interesting, is that the introduction of AI systems into traditional workflows um, is not always seamless and can sometimes disrupt them in negative ways. An interesting example that I heard recently was talking about um, note taking, transcription capabilities for doctors in the medical field. So you would think that would be a pretty innocuous application. It's in the background. You need to take these notes anyway. Take that drudgery off people and a manual task, and automate it, right? It's language. It's something generative AI systems are good at. But one of the things that they reported was that doctors started talking not to the patient, um, but saying things that they wanted recorded in their notes, which changes the dynamic of the doctor-patient relationship. This specific one was when there was a human translator there and caused some confusion for the human translator. Am I supposed to translate this to the patient who doesn't speak the same language as a doctor, or what do I tell them? So I think that's also important to bear in mind as well. I think automating transcription and note taking is a useful application of AI. But we also have to be aware that that could have negative consequences in changing the human behavior in the system, um, even independent of what the AI is doing. So anyway, my deep thoughts on AI for today. But again, always examine those assumptions. Think about who gains from those assumptions being accepted as true. And then, always be, aware of your own domain and your own needs, and pick the right tools for the job. And don't be scared and pushed into making a decision because of fear of being left out. You have more time than you think, and you want to be considerate about how you adopt these technologies. So there you go. That's my thoughts on AI assumptions for today. Hope you enjoyed. If you like the content, please give me a like, subscribe, comment, shout out. Hope to hear from you. And until then, see you next time.